Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm TC Ricks, and this is another instance of my series, The Seven Sins of Silicon Valley. I tend to avoid mentioning too many contemporary events in these kind of series because it dates what I'm discussing, and a lot of what I'm discussing will take years to fix. But this is very relevant to what we're talking about. And frankly, I think that um, the death last night of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, drove home to me how vulnerable as a society we are to the tech companies when it comes to the public square. I think another timely thing that is coming up is that tomorrow, the Chinese app TikTok, which is used by millennials to criticize Trump, among other things, is being just flat out removed from Google and the Apple app stores. And as near as I can tell, there's no indication that they're fighting this in court or anything else like that. They're just Trump just said it's a foreign thing, it's a security threat, it's gone. And Google and Apple are kind of like, okay. And bear in mind that Google and Apple have both taken pride in essentially telling the government to go pound sand when it comes to decrypting phones for criminal cases, which I do laud for privacy rights. But when it comes to an app that employs thousands of Americans with a tyrannical fascist president, oh, well, okay, that's fine. Really? And a couple of days ago, the chief Russian opposition, Navalny, was literally almost murdered with a nerve agent given by, I'm assuming, a Russian agent. We still don't actually know who it was, but it was almost assuredly Putin. The nature of the poison is essentially requires a state actor. And the thought occurred to me, well, what if that had been done to Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Now, it looks like it probably wasn't. She was dying of cancer. But the thing is that, the timing is awfully convenient. What if she had been killed? Let's put it this way. What if there actually was a toxicology report and they tried to get it out there and the government said that due to national security, Google was to delist search results on Google News and Twitter was not to permit people to search for it, and Facebook was to also do the same. The fact is that I noticed just the actual discussion of her death was reduced in Twitter trends and Facebook trends. And the thing I want to discuss in this session isn't so much about the free flow of information. That's something that could be an entire series unto itself, who owns an idea, but specifically the threat that these companies play in terms of the public discussion, right? Look, let me give you. There's a show on right now called The Boys, which is about superheroes that go crazy. But the actual example I want to use is similar but not the same in the comics with Lex Luthor. And at one point in the comics, he gives everyone access to superpowers. And the thing is that he does this in a way to basically delegitimize Superman, who he's obsessed with. But the point I want to point out is when you take the idea of The Boys or Lex Luthor doing something like this, of superpowers, right? You have supervillains and superheroes who are empowered by this pharmaceutical discovery to potentially grant superpowers. But Lex Luthor in the comics just pushes a button and all of a sudden everyone loses their powers because Lex doesn't want him to have them anymore because he doesn't feel that it's had enough of an impact on Superman. So, people that had flight powers are flying along and they suddenly die, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we really need to rethink our concept of what rights we grant a private company, right? On the one hand, on a small scale, private company should totally be able to do what it wants within reason, right? A private company should be able to take somebody that, for example, goes into their store without a mask and is harassing the other customers. They should have the right to get that person out of their business. They're a private business. They have the right to determine who they do or don't want to do business with. But it's not quite that simple, right? Should a company be allowed to say they're not going to do business with black people? Well, there's certain Christians that think that they should have the right to not have to do business with gay people. They shouldn't have to do gay wedding cakes. Now, it gets more complicated, right, because of our sacrosanct free speech. Because, it's you're forcing someone to express and support gay marriage if you make them make a gay wedding cake, right? It's a gray area. I'll at least grant you that. It's an area where there's room for discussion. But I think what we can all agree with is that if a company sponsors a park, right? It's a private park, but they let anybody come onto it, then as long as they've got that kind of a deal with the city, then they have certain obligations to, and there are actual private parks, right? The Occupy New York was on one of them at one point. And if it's got obligations to the government, certain rights granted by the Constitution, like freedom of speech, apply to that private company. When you go from the micro scale to the macro scale, to the point that the majority of all discussion depends on a narrow range of companies who have a vested particular potential interest, it gets really, really frightening, right? As a society, we have an interest in the marketplace of ideas. We have a legitimate interest to make sure that the truth is put out there. But to make a buck, Facebook and Google and Twitter have allowed manipulative lies and false advertising to the point that for a while there was killing people until they started putting out notices about election fraud or attempts to deceive people into how they were voting or mail-in voting or the virus. But to be honest, they only do what they absolutely have to, in my opinion, to avoid what they consider to be legal liability. And between Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter, that's like 90% of all discourse. There's other social media out there, but there's like Instagram that's owned by Facebook. TikTok, well, that's suddenly going to be removed by two of their competitors, but got bought out by Oracle, which is a terrible company and has its own problems and has its own form of monopoly. So, and let's also throw Amazon in there. If you want to self-publish a book, there's plenty of places to do it. But if you're not going to pay Amazon to promote your book, good luck finding it on the Amazon search engine. Like, I'm a self-published author, and that book that I've actually put in the actual name of the book in the Amazon search engine, and it doesn't show up. It doesn't not show up in like the top search engine. It doesn't show up at all. I have to search by my author name, and then and only then does it show up. So if you can't even have any form of neutrality on these markets, right? If you can't have a discussion about something that's timely and necessary, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg with your friends on Facebook, and something terrible happens, if these companies sided with the government, we'd be totally screwed. Now, by the traditional old version of what a monopoly is, they're not monopolies, right? That's how they get around the monopoly laws, right? Technically speaking, Google has competitors. You can go to DuckDuckGo or any number of other, Bing, any number of other search engines. But when you actually do a search, 9 times out of 10, who do you actually use? And you might be an exception to the rule, but the vast majority of people use Google. And Google controls what you see. And Facebook controls what you see. And Amazon controls what you see. And at a certain point, when an activity is central enough to the importance of society and civilization itself, and they have shown such gross negligence in allowing deception maybe we shouldn't allow such a small handful of actors to control that information. Maybe we need to redefine what we call a monopoly. Because while the word monopoly doesn't apply to what Google does, they have an effective monopoly, right? We need to change the law so that when a company gets as large and powerful as Amazon or Facebook or Microsoft or Apple or Google, that we break them up. Or when a company like Twitter empowers someone who blatantly breaks the law, and believe me, he's going to be prosecuted. And after he's prosecuted, we need laws so that when somebody is found guilty of fraud, like he is, and willfully does nothing to prevent it, and trust me, there's a case to be made that they know that he's a fraud, but they do nothing to stop it. Twitter should be culpable for ill actions. Now, I am not asking for Silicon Valley to censor speech. What I am saying is, first and foremost, in fact, you might actually argue that it's contradictory, right? Do I want Facebook to stop Trump from lying, or do I want Facebook to stop interfering with what I see with my friends? Well, the answer is frankly both, right? There's a difference between being able to interact with the people that I signed up to their service to interact with and not be held hostage because everybody's there and there's nowhere else to go. And at the same time, be able to read news and not have it be fake news. You can have both. I'm sorry, the libertarians out there are howling to the moon, but who cares what they think? Because the libertarians get their news from the same places that the conservatives do. And the conservatives have crossed a line. The conservatives are basically going to try and take the Supreme Court. They need to reap the whirlwind. They need to face the music. And frankly, if you're a libertarian, you have some really good ideas, but I have no interest in listening to you pronounce those ideas. I'm going to take your ideas and use them as I feel that we should as a society. And I'm not going to pay any attention when you talk about them because you have no legitimacy. Because you get your news from fake news sites like Fox or the Cato Institute. And it's the same thing with conservatives. The fact of the matter is that we need to change our definition of what a private company is allowed to do once it reaches a certain scale. The tech companies are out of control. They have total control at the large scale dissemination of information. And if they got just a little bit worse in an illiberal democracy, they would allow a dark administration such as the Trump administration, or if you're on the crazy side of town, theoretically, even a Democratic administration. The fact of the matter is no one should have that kind of power. And until we break up these companies, they own the public square. And it might be different segments of the public square. It might be the ability to get your website show up on a search that just doesn't delegitimize because of whatever random decision Google makes, that it's basically trying to improve things for what it considers its large scale customers. God help you if you have a small blog or something like that, because Google's going to make it virtually impossible to find. Or if you're going to basically have Amazon. And again, if you're not paying Amazon, your book isn't going to show up. Or if you want to see what your friends are saying on Facebook, you have to go one by one to each individual friend, because Facebook's psychologically manipulative algorithm, and we'll get to that when we get to the actual Facebook section, is disgusting. So the fact of the matter is that basically the tech companies need to be held to account. And if they aren't, we're screwed. It's just that simple. I'm going to do two more generic sections. One more on the consequences of overreach against the technology companies. We need to rein them in, but we don't want to be anti-technology. There's a difference between not allowing technology to be worshipped unto itself in your culture and still not being anti-technology or stupid. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about the ramifications of what we should do with kind of wrapping up the introduction, and then I'm going to start getting into individual sections for each individual tech company, because I think that there's a lot of value added about talking about the specifics of Google or Uber or Facebook or Microsoft. And frankly, we need to do something about them. We really do.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, available in many markets, including at Amazon.com. Copyright
2019.
Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!